excited to introduce Rachel Manor as she's going to take over Fuel for Thought for us today. She's going to be presenting on a topic that we've received a lot of questions about from our athletes and how athletes can have a healthy relationship with food. And so I would love to tell you a little bit about Rachel. I'll be brief because Rachel really needs to run the show here. But Rachel is the current director of Olympic performance nutrition at UNC-Chapel Hill. She works really closely with their student athletes to educate and counsel and assist them with their meal planning. She has degrees from the University of Portland and from Lipscomb University. She did her dietetic internship at Middle Tennessee State. She is a registered dietitian and a board certified specialist in sports dietetics. And she offers a really unique perspective because she was on her the captain actually of her women's basketball team during her career at the University of Portland. So with that, welcome Rachel. So excited to hear from you today. And again, thanks in advance for being here. If anybody has any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat. I've already collected some questions from our Instagram question boxes. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will get them to Rachel at the end of this conversation. So with that, Rachel, welcome. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. I really appreciate this invitation to speak today. This is absolutely one of my favorite topics to talk about, helping athletes have having a healthy relationship with food. So I'm excited for this opportunity. So let's first start by validating that it's really hard to have a healthy relationship with food. So I really wanted to thank the athletes who reached out about this topic. I hope this is beneficial for you and probably the hundreds of other athletes who are also likely curious about this, either for themselves personally or because they want to help their friends out with this. So as you can guess, this is a pretty complex and nuanced topic. So I'll do my best to answer in the next half hour or so, and then we'll have that Q&A session at the end. But I also included a lot of resources throughout this presentation and at the end for those who would like to take a deeper dive in this topic. I hope this sparks some additional interest, and I hope you guys keep an open mind with this new material. So like I said, having a healthy relationship with food is really difficult. There are so many potential external disruptors that can prevent us from being aware of and tuning into and trusting or honoring our body's own innate cues and needs. Our relationship with food is highly influenced by our environment and by our genetics. So food insecurity and food scarcity is a major issue, especially during a global pandemic, and can play a major role in our food experiences. And then rigid food rules or appearance-related eating that stems from diet culture that ignores a person's inner experience can absolutely disconnect us from our bodies, which we'll talk more about later. And then the media that we consume, all the social media, the ads, the influencers, the filters, the YouTube, what I eat in a day videos, TV shows, movies, magazines, they all play a huge role in how we perceive and how we value bodies. And then family or peer pressure about how we, quote, should eat or how we, quote, should look. Receiving critical or restrictive food messages can certainly lead to body disconnection. And then, various forms of discrimination like racism and classism, sexism, homophobia, fat phobia, they can all influence our body experience and affect our relationship with food as well. And then anxiety or depression or loneliness or other mental health concerns can result in some maladaptive patterns of eating. And there are so many more external disruptors as well. So I do want to acknowledge that it is a privilege to experience a healthy relationship with food. But I think collectively as humans who care about other humans that, we can work together to bring awareness to these potential external disruptors to help individuals and communities connect with their bodies and have a healthy relationship with food. So I mentioned diet culture on the previous slide, and you can likely pick up on a definition based on some context clues here, but I really wanted to provide you guys a more comprehensive definition of diet culture. I think it's important to understand why so many people have a strained relationship with food in the first place. Research shows that about 45 million people go on diets each year, and people who diet are 18 times more likely to develop an eating disorder. In athletes, about 1 in 5 female athletes will develop an eating disorder, and about 1 in 10 male athletes, and many more athletes fall on that spectrum of dysfunctional eating behaviors. And diet culture plays a major role in that. I see it and I hear about it on a regular basis. So this definition is from fellow anti-diet dietitian and intuitive eating counselor, Christy Harrison. She's the host of the amazing podcast called Food Psych, which I highly recommend. And she's also the author of the book Anti-Diet that came out less than a year ago. So this book provides some pretty eye-opening information into the historical roots of diet culture, its roots in white supremacy, colonialism, classism, sexism, and how it's evolved over the decades. It's a pretty fascinating read. So she defines diet culture as this system of beliefs that worships thinness and equates it to health, moral virtue, and superiority. And you'll see this virtually everywhere, and also in sport culture if you're looking for it. So, people often make assumptions about an athlete's skills and their abilities based on their body size. Athletes are told, just lose some weight to improve your joint health, or, if you just lost a few pounds, you perform better. And this is weight stigma. And it's incredibly harmful, and unfortunately it's pretty normalized in diet culture if we don't call it out, and I really think athletes deserve better than this. Diet culture also pressures people to feel compelled to spend a massive amount of time and energy and money trying to manipulate their body size, and who do you think benefits when we feel uncomfortable or insecure in our bodies? Yeah, it's a $72 billion diet industry, and athletes are often targets with calorie counter technologies, macro meal plans, like quick fix supplements, athleisure clothing lines, detox teas, and so much more. Athletes are certainly not immune to the diet industry. And actually, a couple days ago, Victoria Garrick, she's a former USC volleyball player. She actually did a reel on her TikTok, and I saw it on her Instagram, about diet culture that was really spot on. So I highly recommend Victoria Garrick's diet culture reel. So diet culture also demonizes certain foods while elevating others, elevates foods like kale, quinoa, and chia seeds. And, if that sounds elitist, that's because it is. Diet culture forces people to be hypervigilant and hyper aware of our eating and feel ashamed when we eat, what it deems, quote, bad. And this ultimately distracts us from our pleasure and our purpose and our power. And without getting on my social justice soapbox too much, because I was trying not to do that for this presentation, but it's hard not to, because food and our relationship with food is a political issue. But if we take it back to an individual athlete level, and an athlete who hasn't distanced themselves from diet culture, they could be distracted by food rules or how they look in their uniform, and this pulls their focus away from competing, which is why I'm so passionate about getting diet culture out of our sport culture. And then lastly here, diet culture also oppresses people who don't match up to its supposed picture of health. And in sports, this ideal picture of health or a successful athlete is often a pretty narrow look. And this disproportionately harms women, femmes, trans athletes, athletes in larger bodies, people of color, people with disabilities, and this damages both their mental and physical health. This is why it's so important to bring awareness to this, is because it really does affect so many people. So if we want to have a healthy relationship with food, or we want to help our teammates have a healthy relationship with food, I think it's really important that we bring awareness to, how diet culture might show up in our lives, so that we can begin to dismantle and divest from this system of beliefs. So yeah, diet culture has disconnected us from our bodies and our inner intuitive eater, which is what I want to spend most of our time talking about today. So intuitive eating is really just eating if it weren't for diet culture. Intuitive eating was first coined in the, did I get a chat? No, it just popped down. Okay, sorry, kidding. Okay, so intuitive eating was first coined in the 1990s when two dietitians, Evelyn Tribbley, who I did my training with, and Elise Resch, they noticed all of that weight centricism and diet culture, and they saw that it was harming people, their clients, their friends, their family. So they went to the literature, they looked at their personal experience, and so they developed this framework of 10 principles to help us eat for self-care as a way to enhance our relationship with food. Intuitive eating is this dynamic interplay of instinct, emotion, and thought, and empowers us to be more connected to our bodies and better equipped to take care of it. So the first edition of the intuitive eating book came out in 1995, and then another one in 2003, and another one in 2013. But I highly, highly recommend the fourth edition that came out in June of 2020. There's also an intuitive eating workbook that came out in 2017. It's another excellent resource. It has like activities and reflections in it. So I highly recommend those two books. So a little bit more about the history. In 2006, Tracy Tilka and her lab at Ohio State University, they created the first validated assessment tool for intuitive eating, and then they updated it in 2013, much bigger study, and then this time it was validated for men. And this is a big deal because then the research could better quantify and study intuitive eating. So now there's over 125 research studies that show a multitude of benefits, from body appreciation and improved nutrient intake, better psychological well-being, and less disordered eating and binge eating. So this intuitive eating assessment scale is broken down into these 4 domains that actually teaches us about the characteristics of intuitive eaters. So this first domain, this unconditional permission to eat, this reflects an individual's willingness to eat whenever hungry, without labeling foods as good or bad or forbidden. And people who allow themselves to eat unconditionally are less likely to overindulge in food, engage in binge eating, and experience less guilt and shame when eating. And then intuitive eaters are also more likely to eat for physical rather than emotional reasons. And then intuitive eaters are also more likely to trust in their internal hunger and satiety cues and rely on these cues to guide their eating behavior. And then lastly, this 4th domain was added in the 2013 version. So intuitive eaters are also identified to have a positive body-food choice congruence. So this means that intuitive eaters are often choosing foods that promote energy, stamina, and their body performance. So intuitive eaters might ask themselves, like, how does this food make my body feel? Do I like this feeling? And how do I feel after I eat it? And then they use this information to guide their future food choices in a gentle way. So these are a few of the sample questions from that 2013 intuitive eating assessment scale, and I have it listed on my references page. There's also an adapted version of this in the 2020 intuitive eating book as well, and they have that simple yes or no questions instead of that Likert scale. So if you'd like to do some self-exploration, do a self-assessment on your current relationship with food, I'd suggest checking those out. So these are just a couple of additional studies I thought I'd highlight briefly. This first one was done at VCU, or Virginia Commonwealth University, very recently, where female college students used the intuitive eating workbook over an 8-week program, and they found that they experienced an improvement in their body appreciation, satisfaction with life, and experienced a decrease in disordered eating behaviors and weight bias internalization. I would be really interested in seeing this research replicated at other universities as well. And then this one is a meta-analysis completed in 2016 that reviewed the 24 studies over 9 years and showed that intuitive eating was associated with improved psychological well-being, nutrient intake, and emotional functioning. So I also wanted to mention that intuitive eating often gets misinterpreted and misrepresented. So diet culture knows that millennials are not interested in diets. So it's trying to co-opt some of this intuitive eating and anti-diet language, saying things like body positivity or wellness. But if it worships thinness and it demonizes certain foods or bodies, then it's still a diet. So I've seen diet culture try to minimize intuitive eating to a fad, a trend, a diet, to this hunger fullness diet, or like eating intuitively on cheat days or on weekends. And this reductionist expression of intuitive eating is really frustrating to see, because intuitive eating aligns with the anti-diet and the body inclusive message, and with that health at every size message for those who are familiar with that social justice movement. So we were all born intuitive eaters. We really deserve to honor all forms of hunger without guilt, without shame, without food and body policing, and to get our needs met. There is a lot of nuance and depth to intuitive eating. So this is something that often takes time and intention and unlearning and relearning. And the longer that someone's been living in diet culture, or more exposures they've had to it, the harder it is to kind of unlearn and build resilience to those oppressive and distracting messages. I certainly wish I had learned about this sooner in my lifetime. I know it took me a while to grasp as well, but I stayed curious. I kept asking the hard questions, went to the resources, moved through that initial discomfort and the cognitive dissonance that can happen in the beginning. But now I can confidently counsel athletes on how to have a healthy relationship with food with intuitive eating. It just takes time and work and privilege, but I'm really thankful that I'm able to do this work. So if you don't get this right away, that's okay. It's to be expected, but I hope you guys can stay curious. So one of the big stuck points of intuitive eating is this idea that we can only eat when we're hungry and we've got to stop when we're full. And this rigid interpretation can pull us into the diet mentality. So instead, I like to teach people about the different forms of hunger so that they can learn that language to identify it. So, sure, there's biological hunger, those physical feelings of hunger that can feel like that stomach growling, or it could be perceived as fatigue or irritability or dizziness. But, it might sound like I'm feeling sluggish, it's time to eat. That's the easy one for most people. And there's also 3 other types of hunger that are equally valid. So practical hunger is really important for a busy college athlete. So for example, if you're not physically hungry, but you have like a 3-hour bio lab that you can't eat in, it's not like you're not going to eat beforehand because you're not physically hungry. You might adjust your day so that you can eat before the lab, or you eat a small meal or a snack prior to the lab so you don't get ravenously hungry by the end, right? Like, that's smart self-care. And then taste hunger is also important. So this includes, wanting to eat something because it sounds good or you're celebrating. So for example, choosing to eat a new food, when you're traveling with your team overseas and there is a cultural food experience that's not always available. So you're eating for taste hunger, not for biological hunger. And then emotional hunger is maybe wanting to eat a specific food to cope with an intense emotion. So for example, wanting to eat a familiar food to temporarily self-soothe. And diet culture, or the misinterpretation of intuitive eating, would shame us into saying that, we should never ever do that. Diet culture villainizes emotional eating, which often reinforces another round of food restriction and keeps people in that binge restrict cycle, which unfortunately millions of Americans are currently in. Instead, this intuitive eating framework acknowledges that food is comfort and it's a valid way to cope with emotions. And sometimes for children, the only way they know how to cope, so it can be for survival. Now, of course, we want to support athletes to learn to self-soothe in a variety of ways, but we do need to acknowledge that all forms of hunger are valid. So these are the 10 principles of intuitive eating, and the truth is each of these principles are incredibly nuanced, and everyone has their own personal experience with them. The RD Real Talk podcast with Heather Kaplan, she does an episode on each of the individual principles, so that might be a good way to kind of take a deeper dive into each of these principles. My favorite principle, and I think the most important one, is the first one, rejecting the diet mentality. So that's rejecting scales, rejecting weighing yourself, rejecting calorie counting, following any food rules. However, it's not always these explicit things. The diet mentality is really sneaky. So for an athlete, it might sound like, should I eat dessert today? Did I work out long enough? Or it might sound like, I really need to limit my Halloween candy this year. I really went overboard last year. And some people may not recognize this to be the diet mentality because it's been so normalized in diet culture. But like this kind of self-talk and that self-restraint is most definitely the diet mentality. It's certainly not gentle, it's certainly not kind, and not giving ourselves unconditional permission to eat, which I do recognize is really scary at the beginning of intuitive eating. An intuitive eater, they'd be checking in with their bodies, assessing and honoring hunger, challenging the food police, making peace with food. Intuitive eaters give themselves permission to seek satisfaction with food and also respect their body's needs. And then this last principle is gentle nutrition. And there's a reason it's listed as the 10th principle. That's because our relationship with our food and our bodies is so important, and it's got to come first. But gentle nutrition information is important, and it might sound like, for an athlete, you recognize that you're not hungry after a while, after a tough workout. It happens a lot. But an athlete, you're told time and time again from sports dietitians that having carbs and proteins right after a workout, like a chocolate milk or a cherry bundy, can help promote muscle recovery and help prepare you for that 6 a.m. lift that you have tomorrow. So having that knowledge, that gentle nutrition information, you might be guided to choose that chocolate milk after a tough workout, even if you're not hungry. Another example of gentle nutrition might sound like Maybe you've noticed that when you just have cereal and milk for breakfast, that you're hungry in your first class, and that's pretty inconvenient. So maybe thinking about adding some fruit or some nuts to your cereal because you've learned that fiber can help with satiety. That's another good example of gentle nutrition. At the core of intuitive eating is self-care, it's self-compassion, self-respect, and honing in on interoceptive awareness, which is a term that I'd like to talk about next. So interoceptive awareness is one of the keys to intuitive eating. It's our ability to perceive physical sensations that arise from within our body. It's a direct experience, a felt sense that happens in the present moment. Every emotion has a felt sense. We're all feeling something right now, right? Every breath, our heartbeat, our hunger, our thirst, all have a physical felt sense. But the challenge in today's diet culture is that many people don't value or let alone trust these body sensations. And instead, a lot of people look to external cues like MyFitnessPal or a list of superfoods or that thin Instagram influencer, or maybe you're looking to see what your favorite professional athlete is eating. And it may seem easier at first to outsource eating and food choices, but in the long run, it can keep someone, looking for the next best thing or the right thing, when all along we've had the inner wisdom ourselves. Ways to practice interoceptive awareness is mindfulness, meditation, yoga, body scans. For those that have a trauma history, this work probably ought to be done with a trauma-informed clinician. Being subjected to weight stigma in diet culture can be really traumatic for some people. And tuning into interoceptive awareness is not an easy task. But as athletes, we've been practicing proprioceptive awareness for years. So proprioception is the ability to know where and how your body is oriented in time and space. So I played basketball in college. I developed those skills to be very aware of how my body existed in relation to my opponent, the ball, the basket, the sidelines, the end lines. And this was really helpful for my success as an athlete to practice this day in and day out, right? But sometimes I think athletes are shortchanged and we're not taught how to hone into our interoceptive awareness, because it's certainly something that needs to be practiced as well, so we can learn to get our needs met. Not just our physical hunger needs, but our emotional needs as well. So as we wrap up, I hope we're all recognizing that we all can help athletes have a healthy relationship with food. It's not all about personal responsibility at all. I hope this presentation has empowered you to improve your relationship with food, maybe give some tools that you might need. If this presentation boosted your confidence in your ability to intuitively eat and take care of yourself, then that's great. I hope you can help others do the same. So I listed a few items that we could do to help athletes have a healthy relationship with food. So this first one, encouraging athletes to tune into and trusting their interoceptive awareness. Now, if athletes have a history of ignoring or distrusting those internal cues, then professional support may be helpful. And at Northwestern, you guys have multiple sports dietitians that can help. I hope this presentation can also contribute to breaking down any stigma there might be around some help seeking. Also hope you guys can practice merging our instincts with rational thoughts. And then also, appreciating our body and what it can do. And if that's hard for you, know that it's not your fault, and that there's help if you need it. And then also encouraging curiosity and a non-judgmental and gentle approach to food experiences so we can learn and so we can adapt from them. And then cultivating an environment where all bodies, every single one of them, feel safe and supported to honor their body's nutritional needs without diet culture. I'm a firm believer that every single one of us is a culture maker, and I think we can make it a positive one in all corners of the country, in North Carolina and in Illinois and everywhere else in the country. I think this is something that we can all work to collectively do to help all athletes have a healthy relationship with food. So I mentioned some of these books already. But I wanted to give you guys some of my favorite resources. So the Intuitive Eating book, plus the workbook, this anti-diet book, Health at Every Size, The Body is Not an Apology, body respect, fearing the Black body, the racial origins of fat phobia, and body kindness. And then podcasts. So I mentioned the Food Psych podcast and the RD Real Talk podcast. I also really enjoy the Train Happy podcast. That's been a newer one for me, where they are talking more about like exercise and intuitive eating. The Mindful Dietitian, Fiona Sutherland, she's a sports dietitian in Australia who specializes in helping athletes have a healthier relationship with food. She's got a great podcast, and these other ones are great as well. Nail Your Nutrition podcast are two sports dietitians. One of them is also a UNC alum, and they talk a lot about sports nutrition and intuitive eating. And then social media. So if you're gonna be on social media, I want to encourage you guys to cultivate a feed that inspires you and makes you feel good. I know I saw on the Northwestern Instagram account earlier this week, they are encouraging you guys to do the same. So I just want to put a plug in maybe to follow some accounts that can help teach you about how to have a healthy relationship with food, because diet culture definitely doesn't do that. At our UNC sports nutrition account, our tagline is keeping diet culture out of sport culture, and we post a lot about intuitive eating and the anti-diet message. And then like Megan Madrano, Georgie Buckley, Leslie Schilling, the Mindful Dietitian, Fiona Sutherland, they're all anti-diet dietitians that do a great job with their social media platforms. And a lot of UNC athletes have found it beneficial to change up their social media feeds with these accounts to help them with their relationship with food and body image. And then I want to include my references for those of you who wanted to take a look at the literature, and then I'm going to finish up with a meme for you.
I love it, Rachel. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your time and your expertise. It's good for us all to look at what's going on in our own worlds through this lens that we may not have explored before. So we got a couple questions ahead of time, and then we got a question sent to me. So I would like to go through these, how much time we have. It looks like we have enough time maybe to get through all of them before 12:15. So please stick around, everyone, and hear the questions if you're able to, because some things might come up here. And then if you have further questions, just keep putting them in the chat. Okay. The first question that we got was over social media, and it was asking, is it possible to lose weight with intuitive eating?
Yeah, so with intuitive eating, it's possible that some people might lose weight, some people might gain weight, some people might stay the same. It really depends on a person's genetics, their set point, their history with dieting or restrictive eating, and their relationship with food. And like I said earlier, intuitive eating is not a diet, so the purpose of intuitive eating is not to lose weight. The purpose of intuitive eating is to eat for self-care and to nourish our bodies.
Awesome. What about this one? How do I avoid junk food cravings when I'm hungry?
Yeah, so oftentimes those cravings stem from deprivation, whether that's intentional or unintentional restriction. So I think it's important to take that curious, non-judgmental approach to those cravings, and maybe try eating a little bit more at breakfast or at lunch, or adding in some snacks during the day to see how that might affect those cravings. Because oftentimes those cravings it's just a sign of survival. It's our body just giving us some cues that the energy stores are low, so I'm going to crank out those hormones and let that animal brain know that there's a deficit here, and I'm going to need some calorie dense foods. I need some high calorie, high fat, high sugar foods, and I need them now. So that's, like I said, that's normal, and it's a natural survival response. It's not comfortable to feel that way. I know I think every single human has experienced it. But if you have like the financial privilege and the food accessibility privileges to be able to nourish your body consistently throughout the day, you might find that those cravings might diminish. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, great. How can student athletes incorporate intuitive eating when their goals or maybe their practice times really heavily influence what they eat?
Yeah, so I've been working with college athletes for over 9 years, and they certainly have very busy schedules. So we certainly have to adapt to those. But, as as elite athletes, they're hard workers, they're goal oriented. If athletes can stay grounded in their values and their performance goals, they might find that it's a little bit easier to make those food choices that are congruent with those performance goals. So one of those domains of intuitive eating is that positive body food choice congruence. So if athletes can practice that interoceptive awareness, tune into how that food makes their body feel, and can be very curious and non-judgmental about those experiences, athletes can learn quickly, or not so quickly. It kind of depends on your experience, but like how food can help support you in reaching those goals. So I definitely think intuitive eating can still align with the busy college athlete. It just takes work, like everything else.
Mm-hmm. Great. Can you go over some of the first tangible steps that athletes can take to improve their relationship with food? You talked about this a little bit already in your presentation, but anything you want to expand upon or can expand upon those practical, tangible things that we can try today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think tuning into this presentation was a good first step. So thanks to those who attended or listening to the recording. And then I think changing the social media feed is a great first step. Just to take a close eye and how that social media makes you feel, and take a look at some of those accounts that I suggested and who they're following. Taking a look at the intuitive eating book and the workbook. But I think simply just noticing and observing without judgment some of your thoughts and feelings and beliefs around food, and maybe exploring where they came from, can be a really good first step. So when I talk to athletes about diet culture, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so just noticing and observing it and seeing how it makes you feel.
Great. The next one is how should we respond, or how could we respond to diet culture comments from friends or from family, because they might not have the same experience in this presentation that we just heard today. How do you recommend communicating with them when we hear something diet culture like?
Yeah, it happens a lot, unfortunately. And sometimes going home for the holidays can be tough. Some diet culture comments, I think, comes up more often around the holidays than other times of the year, especially around like the new year, right? So I think we all have a finite amount of energy, and sometimes we might just need to change the subject and walk away and protect our mental health. And I think that's a valid approach. But if you have the energy, it might be helpful to be vulnerable, to be real, to let them know how that makes you feel. Maybe set some boundaries around diet talk, could be helpful. If you feel so inclined to maybe take the opportunity to provide some education, I think that could be helpful for some folks. Maybe some seed planting. Nobody's going to get it after one conversation. That never ever happens. But you could plant a seed about I listened to this presentation from this UNC dietitian. She talked about diet culture and how harmful it is, and introduced intuitive eating. Or what I've learned on social media or from the intuitive eating book, just share some education, some information that you've learned, and maybe empower them, let them know what you've done, hey, I've really let go of some of that diet mentality, and it's been really helpful for me. Maybe you could try it out. So I think being vulnerable, being real, setting boundaries, educating, empowering, are some ways to handle it, because it's inevitable. They're going to come up.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good. This one came in just a couple minutes ago. Are there any sports where you feel that intuitive eating just doesn't work, maybe doesn't apply, or maybe is particularly challenging to figure out how to incorporate them? And how would what are your comments on those sports that might think that this doesn't work for them?
I want to talk with those athletes in those specific sports and kind of explore why they don't think that it works for them. Just kind of what are the barriers that they think that they experience, what are some of their attitudes and beliefs around food and nutrition, maybe explore what's been helpful for them in the past in regards to their nutrition, what are some of their performance goals, and how are their nutrition behaviors supporting those goals. I think there's a lot that we could dig into and explore and figure out why intuitive eating isn't working.
Great. Another one that came in today was, what about sports where you, for your position, need to hold an unnatural body weight or an unnatural body composition in order to be successful in your position? Have you had to navigate that at all? And what would you advise people start to think about in terms of, if I don't not intuitively eat, then there's no way I'm going to be able to play my sport?
Yeah, so I might want to explore why an athlete thinks that they need to be at an unnatural weight. What purpose does that serve? I think any kind of restrictive eating doesn't come without risk. And I think, like, as healthcare providers, we've got to do our due diligence and provide that education about risk. If athletes are going to pursue intentional weight loss, then it's not done in a vacuum. So the risks are, increased risk of developing an eating disorder, increased risk of binge eating and weight cycling, an increased risk of poor mental health, psychological decline, more preoccupation with food and body image, and also in the long term are more likely to gain weight and experience that weight cycling. So if athletes want to pursue intentional weight loss, I certainly respect body autonomy. I just think it's not done without risks. And I think they need to know about that.